You're listening to episode 263 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Jay joins us to speak about being trans in Dharma community. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. There is a seeming disparity between the Buddhist concepts of not self and being comfortable in one's identity. We sometimes hear criticism of meditation groups for people of color or for those of particular orientations that they reify ideas of self rather than disassembling them. Or we could look at this as compassionately giving support to our fellow Dharma practitioners in the way that best supports their journey, their safety, and creates the conditions for the growing of wisdom. Jay is a consultant, coach, and mindfulness facilitator. His work focuses on using Buddhist principles to support individuals as they seek to reduce suffering in their lives and find their own meaningful path. Jay came to Buddhist practice in 2009 and completed meditation instructor and group facilitator training with Noah Levine at Against the Stream Buddhist Meditation Society in 2011. He is particularly interested in working with people in recovery and members of the LGBTQ community. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice lavender mint tea. Our guest today is Jay. Jay, welcome to the podcast. I'm very glad you're here.
Hi, Ted. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So we're going to have you tell us about yourself, and that really is the heart of this episode. So tell us about your background and what your story is.
My story is winding, as I think it is for many people. I grew up kind of fairly typical upbringing, a very secular upbringing, this being the Secular Buddhist podcast, very secular upbringing and kind of a mixed faith family. And so spirituality wasn't a big part of my childhood or my upbringing. And when I got to be about, I don't know, high school age somewhere, it started to feel like something was really missing in terms of kind of spirituality. And so I kind of started looking for different things. And at the same time, I was really struggling with, and had been struggling with my whole life, sort of these feelings of feeling different, feeling like I wasn't the same as as other folks, feeling like I was experiencing the world differently, and was really coming to grips with, at the time, what felt like my sexuality and sexual orientation, and I was sort of struggling with coming out of the closet, and that had an interplay or an impact with kind of looking for spirituality. So much of what I felt like I was encountering in religious traditions that I was investigating was this real animosity towards people who didn't identify as being straight. So that was difficult. And so I, for the most part, in college, I was really involved with, actually the Catholic Student Association, but I think that was in large part because it was the right set of people and the right kind of spiritual leadership, and it was a very open and welcoming community. But I think as I dealt more and more with sort of coming out, it seemed like less and less of a good fit. And so really for most of my life, I didn't have much of a spiritual practice, and I was dealing with these issues of my own identity and didn't have any place to go with that really. And so I was mostly just kind of doing my thing out in the secular world and kind of feeling a bit empty and a bit disconnected from myself and from the world around me, and dealing with the depression and anxiety that sort of generated, and the depression and anxiety that came with being queer in America, as it were. And, just kind of going along, I talk sometimes about having lived this sort of life of quiet desperation for many years. I've been with my partner for many, many years, and we just kind of had sort of, we were kind of doing what, I thought you were supposed to do if you live in America in the, late 20th century, and having jobs and that sort of thing, and just really dealing with some deep, deep depression and anxiety along with that. And, I don't know, I want to say it was probably 2008, 2009, I started seeing a therapist for depression. It was starting to impact my relationships. It was starting to impact my work. And so I finally sort of went to see a therapist. And, at some point in the process, she gave me the book, Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach, which I'm sure folks listening to this, some folks will be familiar with that book. And that book really spoke to me. Something about it, something in the way the various practices were presented was very accessible. And so I became interested a little bit in some of the meditation practices that she describes in that book. And then around the same time, because that book had sort of sparked a little bit of an interest in Buddhism, I picked up one of Thich Nhat Hanh's books. I can't remember what it's called. But he basically sort of outlines, Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, how meditation plays into that. And I'd heard of Buddhism. I studied philosophy in college, and I'd heard of it, and I had already heard of sort of Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, and kind of the apocryphal story of the Buddha's awakening and this sort of thing. And so, I picked up Thich Nhat Hanh's book, and I also picked up a book by Noah Levine called Dharma Punks, which really, even though that one's not teaching so much, it's his memoir, that book really spoke to me on a deep, deep level. I was dealing with my own, just the feelings he talked about of depression and anxiety. And, he talks very eloquently about his own struggles with addiction, which is also something that I also have an addiction in my background. And so that book really spoke to me. So then I picked up other books, and started listening to his talks and guided meditations online, which is just, the wonders of the modern age. I remember life without the internet. We did things back then. But yeah, so I started listening to, his talks, and I started really doing the meditation practice, and kind of starting to study it. And then I started, I did that thing. I picked up everything. Joe Joseph Goldstein had written. I picked up everything from Jack Kornfield. I picked up everything from Sharon Salzberg, and really sort of threw myself into it. And I started attending the Wednesday night drop-in groups at the local center where I live with teachers. And that was all hugely helpful. I got involved with, there's actually a local Dharma Punks group here where it's peer-led, and so there's no teacher, and it's just a group of folks that come together and meditate together and then talk about the Dharma together, what they've been reading recently or what their understanding of the different teaching is, and really just come together to discuss the Dharma. And I would say that getting in touch with those folks was hugely transformative for me. I found my people. It really felt like I had found my people, and I'd found a community of people who were, talking about the bigger picture and deeper issues. And I was sort of starting to have this spiritual connection to myself and to other people. And then what happened next is really the crux of it for me, which is that as I did the mindfulness practices and the Brahma Vihara practices of kindness and compassion and equanimity and forgiveness, and I started really getting in touch with what was true for me, that's really what transformed my life in many, many ways. I had spent most of my life trying very hard to fit what I thought other people wanted me to be. And so I spent a lot of my life very keyed in and focused on the outside world and its expectations and what it wanted from me. And one of the things that I perceived the outside world as wanting from me was that it wanted me to be female gendered. This was particularly important, I felt, to members of my family. They were very attached to my identity as a female person. And at the time, I really presented as a very, very lesbian. And in doing these practices, I really got in touch with what was true for me, as opposed to what was true or what other people wanted to be true about me. I actually, touched into the places that kind of knew without a doubt that I wasn't, or I didn't fit in this sort of female gendered body that I'd been born into, and that my experience really was that I wasn't really female identified. And at the time that I was sort of uncovering this, I was really doing a lot of practice. I was doing an intensive training actually with Noah out at his center in LA. And I met through the community, another trans person who I really hit it off with really well. And it was sort of this feeling of like, that same thing of like, I found my people. Like, you're like me. What you're talking about makes sense to me. And so it was partly in being in connection to myself and to what was starting to feel truer and truer for me. And it was also partly in being connection to other people who were having the same kind of experience or had the same kind of experience that I was having. And I realized that that really I'm trans gendered. And then I started the long and complicated process of talking to first my partner about it, because it impacts her, I would say, almost as much as it impacts me. And that was a difficult process. And I really got to this place, the practice gave me this confidence isn't the right word. I don't know what the right word is, but it gave me this sense that I needed to transition. I needed to be my authentic self, regardless of what that might cost me, which was really, really scary, because there was the potential for it to sort of cost me everything, which I think is, I don't know if that's how it feels for other people, but that's certainly how it felt for me. It felt like I could lose my whole family, I felt like I could have lost my partner. I could have lost my relationships with my parents. I could have lost relationships with friends, could lose my job. Like, it really just felt like I'm risking everything.
And for other trans folks that I know, that has been the case, that there has been this tremendous loss, that those concerns came to fruition, and it was an even more difficult transition.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very lucky. I didn't lose everyone. There were a few relationships that I lost. And I think something that's been interesting has been, as I'm about 4.5 years into kind of the medical transition. I don't know that people talk about like, oh, when did you finish transitioning? I don't know if it feels like that for me.
There's no done.
But I had surgery and started taking hormones about 4.5 years ago. And I think there are subtle things that have changed. So I haven't lost my partner. We stayed together, but our relationship has changed. And things have changed on an emotional level that I don't know that I expected, as they have changed. And it's interesting too, just as I'm talking, I'm thinking about the ways in which the practice, particularly mindfulness practice, that asks us to be so in touch with our experience in this moment, how we're experiencing everything, including emotions, I think has really been beneficial throughout my transition, in that I'm able to actually be in touch with, oh, this feels differently than it did before. What does this feel like now? How am I actually reacting to things and engaging with the world? Because it is different. My whole emotional reality is different.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because as you're speaking, I'm noticing the sense that this is it's difficult. It's a difficult practice. Even when not going through transition, this is difficult to look so very deeply inside. And that it's not a matter of the way I had originally contemplated asking this question, what are some of the teachings that have been helpful or perhaps challenging? It's both. These teachings can be helpful and challenging.
That's true. And it's so, it's just interesting as my spiritual practice, I said something to my partner once about, wow, has it really been that big a deal in my life? Or, I don't know why this is so important to me, these practices. And she kind of like, she was reading a book. She like put the book down. She kind of stared at me, mouth a little bit agape. And she was like, Jay, it changed your whole life. The way that this practice, just getting so in touch with what was true for me. And then from that place, being able to, take skillful action, right? Like recognizing that this is true for me and I need to pursue this, and I need to have surgery, which was scary. And I need to, I wasn't originally going to do hormone therapy. I was originally just going to do the surgery and change, my name and pronouns and call it a day. And so I had my surgery, and then it was about 3 months later, I realized that actually same thing. Like the hormone piece is important here. That actually has been the part I think that has done things like changing my sort of emotional reality, or how I engage with the world. But it also gave me this sense, I want to say it was maybe, I don't know, I'd been on hormones maybe 3 or 4 months. And I had this moment. I was just sitting on the couch watching television, perfectly ordinary moment. And all of a sudden, I felt myself drop into my body in a very different way than I ever had before. And feel this like embodied sense of myself. And, we talk about that so much. I feel like in the meditation instruction, teachers will talk about, embodying or feeling the body, and being in the body is such a such a key piece of this practice. And it wasn't until that moment, I think, that I ever actually knew what that meant.
How did it feel different for you than it had before? What was that like?
I wish I knew how to explain it. If I could explain it, my perception is if I could do a good job of explaining it, people would really get what it is about being trans. Like, they would really get, like, because in that moment, I was like, is this what other people have always felt like? This is how they always feel in their bodies? Like, no wonder they didn't understand what I was talking about, because I had never actually felt like I was in my own skin. So it was really this feeling of like dropping down, feeling, I think, therapists talk about being grounded. And all of a sudden I knew what that meant. It was the first time in my life that I'd actually felt like contact from the inside of my body. And I think, I know you alluded to the question of, what's challenging about this practice. And I think that's one of the pieces. All of the teachings around being embodied were really, really difficult for me. They still are to some extent, because my body is the last place I want to be.
It's interesting that you described this event where you were in a very ordinary moment. You weren't on retreat. You weren't in a teaching situation. This was a very ordinary moment. And I think that speaks somewhat to how the practice sometimes often manifests in our lives. It's not necessarily in those intense practice situations. It's from what happens off the cushion, from what happens from having done the work, and things occur which are shifts, and they're very deep shifts in how we perceive things.
Yeah, I think for me, most of the practice has happened off the cushion. Most of the deep insights. It's interesting. There's a number of teachers, they talk about the formal meditation practice as training. And I think the Buddha even talked about, we undertake, these trainings. We train the mind thus, it says in a lot of the suttas. This idea that the formal meditation is training the mind or inclining the mind to be aware and perceptive in these ways. And I find that that's really true for me in how my practice has manifested. I find most of what's valuable for my practice is how it allows me to go be out into the world and, respond to the world skillfully, because I'm cultivating the mindfulness kind of during the meditation practice. And then when I'm out in the world, I have that skill, I have that tool to draw on when I'm feeling really reactive around something, to be able to see, oh, there's the reactivity. What's that about? What's going on here? And then to be able to respond to people without being so reactive. Because I find when I'm not, and this, is true in any circumstance, but particularly when I'm angry about something. And, I find that when I'm in the periods of time where I'm not practicing regularly, formally on the meditation cushion, or I'm not being really aware, all of my discomfort and pain, when I'm not showing up for it on the cushion, it comes out of me sideways, and it comes out of me in really unskillful ways. And I think that part of why, well, I'll only speak to it for one relationship, but I have one familial relationship that I think has really only been salvaged because I've been able to stay somewhat emotionally regulated in communication with this family member, because that I didn't lose many family members. I don't think I lost any family members as a result of transitioning. Some friendships have faded, but I came awfully close with a couple members of my family of not having a relationship with them anymore. And it's been, I think this practice is a big piece of how, at least for my part, I've been able to maintain a relationship with them. Although I have many friends for whom all the mindfulness practice in the world wasn't going to solve the problem with the family members. I'm lucky that I have family members that are willing to want to try to work it out with me, and are willing to kind of side their own personal, issues with my life choices, but I know other people are not that lucky.
Now, in your experiences, as you were mentioning when we were speaking at together over lunch at a conference on diversity and inclusion recently, that you're speaking from your own experiences that may differ a bit from other gender nonconforming people, and you have some advantages. I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little bit for folks who are listening.
Yeah, so I think the first advantage that I have, it's interesting that that conference we were at was kind of a diversity conference. And I think, the first advantage I have is just by dint of being a white person in America. I already have a vastly different experience than people who are members of communities of color, people of color. I have access to, healthcare that other people might not have. I have access to, just based on where I live, I have access to resources that other people may not have. And so I think that's just from day one, I was aware of how much access I had to really healthcare resources more than others. I think that transitioning female to male is very different than transitioning male to female. Just in talking with my trans women friends, I think that their experience, I have no idea what that's like, because my experience was very, very different, going from being sort of female bodied and female gendered to the outside world to now, when I meet people, they just perceive a man. That's who they see, which kind of leads into one of the other places where I am super privileged, which is that I have passing privilege, pretty much at the top of the passing privilege chart or scale. Even other trans people don't read me as being trans when they meet me. And that's a huge difference as well. And so, when I walk into a room and people are meeting Jay for the first time, they think they're just meeting, and my partner is female, so they think that they are meeting straight white guy. And so in terms of my, reactions, my interactions with the external world, I am in the position of the most privilege in America today, right? I now have white male privilege that I didn't have before. And I think the passing privilege is really huge. My experience, I had somebody actually really recently ask me, just being out in the world, has the way people treated me gotten better or worse? Just, strangers on the street. And it's gotten better for me, because I went from being this very butch woman, and so getting double takes on the street, getting nasty looks on the street, having people, it seems so often it boils down to bathrooms a lot these days when we talk about trans issues and trans politics. But, having people, approach me in the bathroom and say, well, this is the women's room and that sort of thing, to now just presenting as just another dude in the world that nobody gives me, there's nothing to double take. And, walking into men's rooms and nobody's even paying any attention. There's a whole set of gender nonconforming folks who are not in the binary. And they're not male identified. They're not female identified. Whatever, there's a laundry list of words that people use. I tend to talk about, they're not in the binary. And that's a whole other experience, because I went from being in the binary as one gender to being at least perceived in the binary in the other gender, which I think is very different than being non-binary. Now, I will say, for me, part of my struggle is that I've lost my identity a little bit as a queer person, or as a kind of non-conforming person, because I don't get perceived that way. So people don't know it about me unless I tell them, which on the one hand is nice. It means I get to choose whether or not I tell them. But on the other hand, I've lost that immediate recognition of being part of that group, of queer people. And so that's been a little bit difficult and challenging, because I would never say, like, if I'm given the choice, right, like, I'm not male. I wasn't born that way. I wasn't socialized that way. And my body still isn't a male body. I really am a different gender than the male female dichotomy that we all get slotted into. But the outside world doesn't perceive that about me, which is also, talk about the practices. There's a part of me that feels like anytime I'm talking about gender or talking about my transition or transition more generally, I'm talking about impermanence, right? I'm talking about identity. Like, I'm talking about these really key core, sort of Buddhist teachings. I had a friend ask me very early on, in the transition process, when I was just starting to tell people, I was just starting to ask, friends and, to start using different pronouns and to start calling me Jay. And I had this one friend kind of ask, and he was a friend from the Dharma community. And he kind of was like, well, but what about, aren't you clinging to an identity? Aren't you just being attached to gender and to an identity? And what about, the teachings around non-identification and not self? And, I never had a good answer for that, really, other than to sort of talk about things on, like, the relative level versus the sort of ultimate level. And that kind of gets a little bit esoteric. And I know you had him on recently. Lama Rod Owens said something once that really, I was like, oh, that's the language I've been looking for all this time. And he said something like, we have to embrace identity before we can transcend it, or something like that.
Yeah, and there's also the idea that we are brushing away a little dust, that we're not clinging to, we're not reaching for something else. We're releasing a falseness, something that is not true, that is, as you said at the beginning, externally imposed. It's not true. It's not how things are. And that's an important part of this practice, is helping us see things as they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. That's it exactly. And there's just that thing of, like, yeah, we have identities out in the world of, how we feel on the inside. And there's something about, this idea I'm really working with lately of integrating the internal experience with the external experience. And that feels so much like what this path asks of us in many ways. And I recently left a job that was kind of a management consulting job, because it felt in many ways like my sort of spiritual practice was happening in isolation from the rest of my life. And I'm now looking to pursue graduate studies at divinity school and really look to integrate my spiritual life, which is such an important part of my life internally, with how I am in the world and what I'm using my life's energy for externally, and this idea of kind of integrating the two. And so I think transition is similar, right? I have this internal felt sense of who I am, and then the medical transition and the hormones is really just about integrating that internal felt sense with then how I am in the world and how I'm perceived in the world.
Yeah, it's interesting, this background that you have in being essentially a fairly secular person, and yet there is also the acknowledgement that as a human being, there are things which deeply move you, that call to you, and that you're pursuing those. And that is a learning, and that is about how you are, how you meet the world, and who you are within that world. And I know it must be very difficult, or I expect it must be very difficult to meet questions like, the one you were saying, but aren't you just being attached to identity? Because it could be a subtle judgment, a subtle condemnation of who you are and what you're doing and how you're living your life. And it could be a sincere question, a will to explore through a not understanding, which is perfectly innocent. So that's got to be an interesting situation for you as you get those, and you really need to sense into what's under the sheets here behind this question.
Yeah, and it's interesting, that question from that person was somebody that I knew fairly well, and so it was definitely kind of the second. It was a genuine question, and a genuine sort of wanting to understand how I was sort of understanding what I was going through in light of kind of the classical Buddhist teachings. But I think other times, yeah, I get questions and it's unknown sort of what's the genesis of the question, sort of, taken at face value, or is there something else going on underneath the question?
So you mentioned a few of the folks from Dharma Punks. We've had them as guests on the podcast, Noah and Josh and Dave Smith and others. And I'm wondering, how has the community responded to you on your journey?
So this is a great question. This is another place where I am incredibly lucky, and where I think my experience, I don't know if it's different from other people that are practicing in various Buddhist traditions. I suspect it's different than the experience that some people face in other religious traditions, which is that my spiritual teachers, you mentioned Noah and Dave Smith, and also there's a number of other teachers in Los Angeles and then also here on the East Coast, they've all just been incredibly supportive and welcoming, and it's an amazing community to be a part of. My local Dharma Punks community was instrumental. They were some of the first people that I reached out to, even before some of my family members, to start experimenting with different pronouns, using a different name. And, there's this interesting thing that I really key in on. I don't know if I suspect other trans people key in on this, but, pronoun usage is really important thing. Getting, using the correct pronouns for someone. I have to say that my local Sangha, they've never mispronounced me. And that's huge. That's huge to me, to be able to, particularly it can be difficult, folks, to change the pronouns that they're using for someone. But there's also this way in which it's noticed, people who immediately were able to start using different pronouns and never mess up the pronouns, was really quite something. And to be people who, I would have felt totally comfortable in correcting them if they had used the incorrect pronouns. And so that was huge, kind of early on. And, members of the Sangha came over and helped take care of me after my surgery. And, one of them gave me a little Ganesha statue to bring with me to the hospital. They were just incredibly supportive. And then the teachers, the larger community at Against the Stream, which is kind of the Dharma Punks, is kind of a peer-led sort of thing, but Against the Stream is the actual center that Noah founded out in Los Angeles, and there's a couple other Against the Stream centers around the country, and they're just amazing in terms of how welcoming they've been, but also how open and receptive they are to when gender nonconforming members of the community approach them with suggestions for how to be more inclusive, how to be more welcoming. They're just right on it. I would never feel like I couldn't ask for some kind of, hey, you might want to think about whatever it is, right? Like having all gender bathroom space made available or whatever it is. And they're just really tremendous in that way that I think, I certainly notice. I can't speak for other members of the community, but when they get it right, they absolutely get it right. And my experience has also been that when they miss, they're very open to suggestions for how to make changes and implement those changes very rapidly. So they're really committed to inclusivity in that way.
It's interesting you brought up the idea of their own openness and receptivity to you, and you said they hadn't really missed a beat. They were really on top of this, but that you were much more comfortable in providing those insights and corrections if errors arose. And I'm wondering if it's their very openness and receptivity gave you that comfort to be able to make corrections if they came up.
Yeah, I think so. I was recently on a retreat where all gender bathroom space had not been established. And I think it was because it was in large part due to the retreat center where we were was a Buddhist retreat center where there's a community of monks and nuns that live there, and they segregate by gender as a community. And so that sort of then trickled into the space that we were using and the accommodations that we had. And I felt I didn't have any sort of concerns or qualms sort of going up to the retreat manager and sort of saying like, hey, we might need to, we might want to consider having an all gender bathroom and maybe, an all gender shower area or something. And, very quickly they made those accommodations. And I think you're right. I think I knew that request would be well received and wouldn't just be brushed aside. And so I think, in other places, I don't know that I would necessarily feel as able to make a request like that because I wouldn't know how it would be received or, that sort of thing. I don't know that I'm articulating what I'm trying to say very well. But.
No, you did. And I'm wondering what words you might offer to someone perhaps just awakening to their own non-conforming sense of identity.
I've had a couple conversations, people have come to me who are sort of starting to wonder or starting to question. And I've actually gotten this from practice, but I think that one of the key things is like, it's okay to just not know. Right? There's a period of figuring it out, and can be periods of questioning. The culture that we're in has very rigid gender roles and expectations of gender. And I think that oftentimes, I've had a couple friends who have sort of started questioning, and they've come to realize that actually they're perfectly comfortable in the gender that they're in or in the body that they're in, and that they aren't trans. It's just that the way they express that gender doesn't match sort of cultural expectations versus other folks who, really feel like actually I'm something different and this gender doesn't fit my experience of who I am or how I feel in the world. And so I think part of it is just sort of patience with self, and that it's okay to not know. It's okay, just asking the question and sort of being with and sitting with the question, I think is useful. And I also think, part of what can be difficult is this idea that it's really scary to think about how it will change relationships with other people. Other people are really invested in our gender for whatever, I sort of joke, it's the first thing that happens to you in your life is that you get assigned a gender. And so to then sort of say, well, I'm not this, really can shake people up. And so, having a lot of self-compassion that it's difficult and it's challenging, and the questioning alone can be very scary because it is this thing. I was once in like a statistics class or something, and they gave gender as an example of something that's, mutually exclusive and can be either or, can't be like whatever it was. Like it's so ingrained in the way we think about gender that to start even asking the question, even just to ourselves, can be a really scary thing. And so I think, that for me, I think just validating that the not knowing is okay, and to just have a lot of self-compassion around how scary it can be to even ask the question or to even be having the questions. And, I was thinking about whether or not I was trans for a good 9 months before I said anything out loud to anyone. And that was after, at the time, probably been about maybe a little bit more than a decade and a half of, I'd had a friend transition in college, and I'd had a thought like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I should consider that or think about that. And then I vocalized that to someone, and their response was so viscerally negative that I didn't even think about it again for over, like I said, it was probably a decade and a half. It was probably, 15 years or so between that experience and the next time I even considered it to myself. And so I think it can be a long process. I think it's amazing. There's so many, I'm approaching middle age, but there's so many of kind of the younger sort of generations after mine that are really they're blowing up gender norms in huge, huge ways. And really, it's amazing to watch some of these, kids in all these kids like suing their high schools and middle schools and elementary schools for gender accommodations and things is really amazing.
I wanted to add something to what you were saying about it's okay to question, and self-compassion is huge, is that sometimes those may be just the space we inhabit, sometimes what's called for in this moment, and that moment may be months or years, is self-compassion is really what we need to practice, or the questioning. It doesn't have to be both at the same time, and one shouldn't feel the need to be overburdened by having to do too much. Sometimes it's okay to just inhabit that space of self-compassion or that place of questioning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, part of what for me has been so transformative about the practice is just that space that it allows. I have a tendency, and it isn't really even anything to do with being trans. I just am a kind of person who, I want to be out of my discomfort immediately. And so that often means like, I feel like I have to take action right now, this second. And I think what the practice allows is this ability to soften around that discomfort and, have that self-compassion of like, oh, this is just hard. This is just uncomfortable, without having to actually take action on it. Because I find, this is kind of what I was saying a little bit before, when I act from that place of I'm uncomfortable and I need to stop being uncomfortable, I'm usually not skillful in how I respond to the world out of that discomfort. And that self-compassion piece has really been the linchpin for me of the practice.
So how about for those who are not trans and have trans people in their life? What might you suggest to them?
So I think the people that have been the biggest allies for me have been the folks who, as I was sort of mentioning before, they use the correct pronouns. It's that thing of, they meet me where I am. They relate to me as the person who I am, as opposed to the person that they want me to be. And honestly, it's the people who don't make a big deal out of it, right? Like I just, it's like they have male friends, they have female friends, and they have trans friends, or they have gender nonconforming friends. And it's not even, it's not even a thing. But that when I want to talk about it, they're open to me sort of talking about it and processing it. I think the other thing is for the most part, up until fairly recently, I could give you the names of everyone who I had told that I was trans, or everyone who had known me before, people that I had met since transitioning that I had told I was trans. And, one of the things that made those people safe, one of the things that was really critical, is that I knew that they weren't going to go share that with other people. And I think that's part of, seeing me for who I want to be seen as. Like, it's kind of a non-issue with those folks, but it's also, that I can trust, there are, even as white male presenting as I am, there are some circumstances and some places where it doesn't feel safe to have people know, just issues of physical safety. And so I think that thing where I can just trust that people aren't going to go, I heard this thing. Did you know this about this person? That they're not going to engage in that kind of idle chatter, that they're not going to sort of start the rumor mill is also a really big deal. That people feel safe to sort of share that part of my life with, because there are definitely, even just in my daily experience, there's a couple of communities that I'm a part of where it wouldn't necessarily feel safe for all the members of those communities to know my gender status, which is kind of a weird thing, because again, we all sort of walk through the world making assumptions about what gender we see walking down the street towards us. And sometimes it's nice to just have people just make that assumption about me, that I'm just another dude. And so I think the people that are, that I sort of really consider allies, are the people who don't make a thing out of it. When I want to talk about it, they're open to me talking about it. And they get my pronouns right. And they have my back. Yeah.
Well, for folks listening to the podcast, I am going to be linking to a couple of books that we mentioned today on the episode page for this episode. Jay, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I hope any of this was useful or helpful to any of your listeners. I think, I can't say enough about how much these practices have really changed my life for the better, and they're deeply entwined with how I've experienced transition.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.